Okay, let's just jump right in. Imagine hearing that an area of untouched, vital forest, the kind scientists call tropical, pristine primary forest about the size of Panama, just disappeared in 1 year.
It's a staggering thought.
And not just that, but the rate of that loss shot up by 80% compared to the year before. That's one of the really stark numbers we need to grapple with today from a major new report.
Yeah, it's definitely a wake-up call. It highlights some, well, pretty alarming trends in global forest loss, especially in the tropics.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're taking the key findings from this important report. It's from the World Resources Institute and the University of Maryland, and specifically, we're looking at how the Indian Express covered it. We really want to understand what these findings mean.
Right. Digging into the numbers, the causes.
Exactly. We'll unpack the figures, figure out why this record loss happened, look at where it was worst, and maybe most importantly, explore why this matters to you. Whether you're just trying to stay informed on global issues, or maybe you're prepping for exams where understanding these complex environmental dynamics is crucial. This data is key.
And the report paints well, a pretty grim picture. One of the most startling things it reveals is the unprecedented and, frankly, kind of terrifying role that fires played in 2024.
Okay, so let's get straight to those headline numbers then. What was the big picture on global forest loss last year?
Well, the top-line finding is blunt. Global forest loss hit a record high in 2024. It smashed previous levels.
And focusing on those really critical tropical pristine forests, these are the irreplaceable ones, right? The old growth at carbon sinks, biodiversity hotspots.
That's where the numbers get particularly alarming.
Hmm.
We lost 6.7 million hectares of those specific forests. And like you said, that's an 80% jump from 2023, putting it in scale.
Yeah.
Roughly the size of Panama.
An 80% increase in losing those forests. It's just staggering. But the report also flags something unusual, even frightening, according to one expert, about how this loss occurred.
Yes, and this is a really grim milestone.
Mm-hmm.
For the first time ever in this annual report, fires were the #1 cause of tropical primary forest loss. That's highly unusual for ecosystems like the Amazon.
Quite unusual because they're normally too wet.
Exactly. They're naturally humid environments. They aren't supposed to burn on this massive scale. It suggests something fundamental has shifted.
And this brings us to that quote from Matthew Hansen, co-director of the lab behind the data. He said, "The signals in these data are particularly frightening." And he mentioned this fear, this idea that the climate signal is going to overtake our ability to respond effectively.
And that's significant because it frames this not just as data points, but as real evidence. Evidence that climate change isn't just adding to forest loss, it's fundamentally changing how it happens, pushing these ecosystems past their natural limits.
Okay, so the what is record loss, driven mainly by fire in the tropics. Let's shift to where. Where was this hitting hardest? The report was quite specific.
It was. Latin America got hit disproportionately hard. If you look at the entire Amazon biome, primary forest loss there hit its highest point since way back in 2016.
And within Latin America, Brazil, which holds the biggest chunk of the Amazon, sadly saw the most loss overall.
Correct. Brazil lost 2.8 million hectares. That's about 6.9 million acres. And this is important. It marks a big reversal from 2023.
A reversal? How so?
Well, in 2023, there had been some positive signs, some progress under President Lula's administration in actually curbing deforestation. So this 2024 data is a significant step backwards.
And what did the report pinpoint as the main reason for Brazil's setback in 2024?
It ties directly back to the fires we mentioned. Brazil really struggled to contain massive wildfires in the Amazon. The report links this struggle directly to the worst drought ever recorded in the rainforest.
Wow, worst ever.
Yeah. And that drought, the report says, was heavily fueled by climate change. There's a quote from Andre Lima from Brazil's Environment Ministry saying, "This was unprecedented. We have to adapt all our policy to a new reality." He specifically said fire, which wasn't usually a top cause, is now a top priority.
That really highlights the challenge, doesn't it, when the actual mechanisms of destruction are changing so fast. And it puts a particular spotlight on Brazil, especially since they're hosting the next big global climate summit in Belém this November.
Exactly. It creates a very stark, very immediate context for those crucial international climate talks.
Yeah.
Happening right there, in a country battling record forest fires.
Now, while Brazil lost the most in sheer area, there was another country in Latin America that saw an absolutely dramatic surge in its rate of loss, right? Even overtaking countries with way more forests.
That would be Bolivia. Shockingly, it jumped past the Democratic Republic of Congo into second place for tropical primary forest loss in 2024.
Second place, despite having much less forest than the DRC.
Less than half the forest area, yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite dramatic.
And the increase itself was huge, something like 200%. What drove that?
The report points to a dangerous mix in Bolivia. It wasn't just the drought and wildfires, though those were factors. It was also significantly driven by government-incentivized agricultural expansion.
Ah, okay, so that's a key difference. You have the climate pressures drought, fire risk colliding with deliberate policy pushing for more agriculture.
Precisely. It underlines that while climate change is a massive amplifier, human decisions about land use, about policy, are still very much in the driver's seat in many places. The report also noted similar worrying trends elsewhere in Latin America, too.
Where else?
Places like Mexico, Peru, Nicaragua, Guatemala, they also saw significant increases in forest loss.
And beyond climate and agriculture, did the report mention any other drivers?
It did, briefly. It noted that conflict can also exacerbate deforestation. It specifically mentioned Colombia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where sometimes armed groups exploit natural resources like timber or clear land for control.
Okay, so the tropics, especially Latin America. It's a pretty alarming situation, driven by this potent mix of climate-fueled fires and policy choices. What about forests outside the tropics? Did the report look north, at the boreal forests?
Yes, and the news wasn't good there either, unfortunately. Boreal forests, you find those in colder regions like Canada and Russia, and they also hit record levels of tree loss in 2024.
Record levels there too. How much?
Canada and Russia each lost a massive 5.2 million hectares. That's 12.8 million acres per country.
And what was driving that? Similar causes.
Largely, yes. Wildfires getting out of control. Now, boreal forests have actually evolved with fire. Seasonal fires are natural there. But the report suggests the scale and intensity in 2024 were way beyond the norm.
So again, potentially climate change making things worse. Hotter, drier conditions.
That seems to be the implication, pushing those natural fire cycles into overdrive, making them far more destructive and widespread than usual.
Right. It feels like a lot of negative trends globally, with climate change amplifying fires being a common thread. But were there any bright spots, any places that managed to push back against this trend?
Thankfully, yes. There were some important outliers. Southeast Asia, for example, actually bucked the global trend.
Oh, really? Which countries?
Malaysia, Laos, and Indonesia all managed to post double-digit decreases in their primary forest loss.
That's fantastic news. How did they manage that, according to the report? What made the difference?
It seems to be a combination of things working together. Strong domestic conservation policies being actively implemented, plus effective efforts on the ground by local communities and also the private sector.
So a joint effort.
Yeah, working together to actually contain fires when they start, and also getting a better handle on agricultural expansion. It shows that focused action involving different groups really can make a tangible difference.
That's encouraging. And there was another specific success story mentioned, even within Bolivia, a country that otherwise saw that huge surge. That seems really significant.
It is, and it's a fascinating contrast. There's an indigenous territory in southern Bolivia called Charagua-Yambay. They managed to keep forest fires largely out of their territory, despite the national trend going the other way.
How?
The report credits their success to having really specific, well-enforced local land use policies, combined with using effective early warning systems for fires.
So local governance, indigenous knowledge playing a key role.
Exactly. It really underscores the potential for that kind of localized management and traditional knowledge to be incredibly powerful tools for conservation, even when the bigger picture looks bleak.
That Charagua-Iamba example feels really important to hold on to. Okay, so let's try and tie this all together. We've covered the record loss, the shocking role of fires, the hot spots like Brazil and Bolivia, the boreal challenges, but also these glimmers of hope in Southeast Asia and specific territories. Why does all this data matter? Why should you, our listener, care maybe, especially if you're tracking current affairs for something like the UPSC exams?
Well, this report gives us critical quantified insights into the massive forces reshaping our planet right now. You're seeing clear evidence of how climate change isn't some abstract future threat. It's interacting now with things like drought to cause unprecedented environmental damage, like these massive fires in tropical forests that shouldn't burn like this.
Right. It's not just about trees somewhere far away.
No. It's about the stability of the global climate we all depend on. It's about massive biodiversity loss. It's about the livelihoods of countless communities directly reliant on these forests. And ultimately, it's about the health of the entire planet. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for grasping current global challenges.
And that shift,
Hmm.
the fact that fires are now the dominant destructive force in these vulnerable tropical ecosystems, that feels like a really key takeaway, linked to what Matthew Hansen warned about.
It absolutely is.
Hmm.
It signals that these ecosystems are under such intense stress, likely from warming and drying, that they're crossing tipping points. They're becoming vulnerable to rapid, widespread destruction from things like fire in ways they simply weren't before.
Which brings us back to the policy and, importantly, the funding side of things, which the report and the Indian Express coverage also touched on.
Yes. Rod Taylor from WRI put it very bluntly. He said, at the moment, there's more money to be paid by chopping forests down than keeping them standing.
That's a stark reality.
It is, and it highlights this huge economic challenge. We need better ways globally to fund conservation, to create real economic incentives that actually value standing forests for all the benefits they provide. That's why discussions at places like the upcoming summit in Belém are so critical. They need to tackle this funding gap head on.
And understanding this whole complex picture, climate change impacts, agricultural economics, government policies, conflict, conservation successes, the funding problem, that's absolutely essential knowledge, isn't it? For staying informed, for seeing the interconnectedness of global issues, and yes, for anyone preparing for exams covering current events and environmental challenges, this report is packed with relevant insights.
Precisely. It helps you see the connections, understand the systemic issues, and recognize that the solutions also need to be multifaceted.
Okay, so just to quickly recap the main points, 2024 saw devastating, record-breaking global forest loss. Wildfires, fueled by climate change and drought, became the #1 driver in the tropics for the first time. That's unprecedented.
Latin America, especially Brazil and Bolivia, was hit hardest due to a mix of those fires, drought, and also agricultural policies. Boreal forests also saw record fire-driven losses.
But importantly, there were exceptions. Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Laos, Indonesia showed that progress is possible with strong policies and concerted effort. And specific local examples, like the Chiragua-Yamba territory in Bolivia, show the power of community-led conservation.
It's a sobering picture overall, highlighting the immense climate challenge, but also showing that human action, policy, and local efforts can still make a vital difference.
So as you think about all this, maybe consider this point, building on what Rod Taylor said. If the current economics favored deforestation, what would it really take to flip that? Is it about massive international funding shifts, new carbon markets, or is it more about empowering those local communities and indigenous groups like in Chiragua-Yambe, who often have the deepest connection and knowledge to protect these forests?
That's arguably the core question we need to answer if we want to genuinely reverse these alarming trends.
This deep dive into the 2024 global forest loss findings was based on the significant report from the World Resources Institute and the University of Maryland, and our discussion drew on the coverage by the Indian Express. This kind of information is vital for understanding the state of our planet, the challenges ahead, and yes, it's highly relevant if you're tracking major global developments for exams or just to be informed.
Definitely encourage you to keep exploring this topic. There's always more to learn about these complex systems.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, please do give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us continue bringing you these kinds of analysis. We'd also love to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Any further questions, or maybe other topics you'd like us to unpack in a future deep dive, let us know.